Hey, Not the No Church family. Pastor Philip here with a devotional before you. I am in 1 Kings chapter 17. We're going to be talking about Elijah raising the widow's son. Let me give you some context. The context of this passage is, you remember Jezebel? Everybody thinks Jezebel, ooh, evil lady. Jezebel has done some evil things. She's married Ahab. And because of that, Ahab marrying him, she brings all kind of evil upon the nation. And so she starts worshiping Baal, he starts worshiping Baal, and because of that, God sends a drought across the land. Specifically, it hit hard in the area of Samaria. So Elijah's in this story. He's the one that's going to raise the widow's son. God takes care of Elijah. He feeds him with ravens, and he provides water for him through that. And while he's there being fed by the ravens and God's taking care of him, God says, hey, I want you to go and meet this lady. He basically tells her, go down to this certain spot, and there's this widow, and I want you to ask her for food. And he does that, and that's what we see at the first part. To make a long story short, he asks for it, even though she knows she's getting ready to go die. Her and her son are at their last. They don't have any water left. They don't have any food left, and he's asking for that last morsel of food. Not only that, they know they're getting ready to, once they do that they're going to sacrifice their own stuff. So she's obedient, and God provides the oil in her flask never to go empty, and never does she run out of flour. She's always got that. But we get to this point here, everything's okay until this right here. Verse 17. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. And his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin in remembrance and to cause the death of my son? And he said to her, give me your son. And he took him in his arms and carried him up to the upper room chamber where he lodged, and laid him on his bed. And he cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even to the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son? Then he stretched out himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came back into him again, and he was revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son lives. And the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth, and it is true. What a great story. This could you make a movie about something like this, where Elijah is called out to be obedient to God. Notice the different times there's obedience. He's sent, Elijah's obedient to go, and then he asks the lady to be obedient. When she's obedient, they provide. And then he says, let me have your son. She didn't push him away. She lets him have him. She takes him up to the room and asks God. And he's asking and pleading, knowing that God can provide. And God revives this kid. I want to look at 3 simple things for us to look at this for our own self as we look at this passage. One is, God's commandments are meant to show us his provisions. God's commandments, when he gives us a command, is to show us how he provides for us. So many times I forget that. When God tells me to do something, whether it's to love my neighbor or whether it's to love you in the church, that's to show that he will provide for me. Secondly, God's commandments are meant to show us his power. When God does something like this and he tells us he provides, but in that provision it shows me how powerful God is. He can do all things. And thirdly, God's commandments are meant to show us his plan. Sometimes I forget and I get caught on, one tree in the forest. And I can't see the big picture God has. And I forget that. Sometimes I doubt, in the hardest times, I forget what God can do for me. And through obedience, he provides for me, he shows me his power. But ultimately, when God gives me those things, all of a sudden I realize, hindsight's 20/20, right? I understand his plan. His plan all along was to show us how powerful he was and that he has things there and provide for me in my worst times. And this is what happens in the middle of a drought where they're being punished for really the king's wife. Drought is across the land. God's providing for him, and he goes and he just shows his power through this situation where he not only provides for them food, but he also gives life. I think we can look to the New Testament, and God tells us multiple times, and Jesus says, ask anything of us, and I will give it to you. I think in our world of we're trusting God's sovereignty and knowing what our responsibility in that balance, sometimes we get cynical in our prayer. We decide that it's not worth asking for the hard things. We don't think God's going to provide, but yet he's told us to do that. My question to you as a disciple, are you following Jesus? A disciple is basically following Jesus in what he says to do and being obedient to him. If we're obedient to him, I think he'll do those three things. He'll show us his provision, his power, and he'll also show us his plan. So I challenge you to do that. What an awesome story out of 1 Kings 17.